Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. You are listening in to our Ask the Arborist segment, and that is something we do once a month. And if you're new to Trees Atlanta, our mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forest, and we do that through planting, conservation efforts, and education. Today, our arborists are Greg Levine, and he is the co-executive director for Trees Atlanta, and Neil Norton, who's the executive director of the Georgia Arborist Association. We want to make sure that this is a really positive environment for everyone. We do have some questions that were pre-submitted to the program, and you can also ask questions live. There is a Q&A bar at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. At any point in time, feel free to send your questions there, and we will moderate those questions as they come in. And we also want to know how we can serve you better. So after this event, you're going to receive an email with a survey. If you could please give us some feedback. We also want to know if there are any topics that you'd like to learn about. You can also go to our website and you can sign up for our newsletters, see any other events that we have going on and other opportunities, and there are a ton of resources. And you can also find us on social media. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our arborists today. So Neil and Greg, you guys can go ahead and introduce yourself.
So I'm Greg Levine. I'm co-executive director of Trees Atlanta. I've been a certified arborist, I believe, from 1999 or 2000. Neil and I were just discussing that. We took our test fairly close to each other. And obviously the majority of the work I use for arborists more is on the planting side and on the maintenance side. And I obviously know about pest and proper pruning, but the most of my experience is not around pest, which is good because Neil does a lot more of that. And looking forward to having a conversation with everyone.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. So I'm Neil Norton. I'm the executive director of the Georgia Arborist Association. I'm also a consulting arborist on the side. I do that as well. And I want to thank Trees Atlanta for this opportunity today. I became an arborist through Trees Atlanta originally way back in 2000 when I first met Greg and the team. And I've been hooked on trees ever since. So thanks, Trees Atlanta.
Well, that's great. That's actually a really good segue to our first question. How can someone get into this line of work? How can they become an arborist?
Neil's the expert on that.
Well, it's actually, go ahead, Greg.
No, you're the expert on how you, I mean, it used to be you had to work in the field for at least 2 years and then take an exam. I don't know what it is today. Work for a company or in the field at doing tree work. I don't think you have to necessarily work for a company that has a certified arborist. You just have to work with trees. Now, has it changed since, Neil?
No, it's still a 2-year requirement. You can get, I think, a year of experience if you have a degree in a related field. So you can do it through that way as well. The work experience is generally the hardest thing, but after you have that accomplished, you can take the test, which is I think it's about 150 questions on just trees. So if that sounds exciting to you, you're definitely an arborist in the making. So, and a lot of those questions, I mean, a lot of that, it used to be that you can actually take the test now at home. It costs a little bit more money. But you can also, once things start opening up again, they'll have open testing. That's less expensive to do it that way.
An idea about the test, he says 150 questions on it. It's everything from tree identification, pest identification, tying ropes, proper pruning, and then some, I think some legal component. There's about 6 or 7 different components of that you have to answer questions on. But as an example,
there's like 12 components, or now it's actually, I think, 14. So
I took it.
Plant healthcare, but we won't go through it. But what you need to do is that the Georgia Arborist Association has a course, and we go through the study guide, which costs about $70. You need to purchase that study guide from the ISA. I have it in the other room. I'd show it to you because
It
it's
looks like your hands.
it's like the Bible of arboriculture, and you need to know that book. And then the Georgia Arborist Association, July and September, does a review course where we go through each chapter. We go through we go through 2 chapters a week, and it lasts for 8 weeks. So, and we review the whole process of how to be an arborist, and we try to keep that really affordable because we need more tree advocates and people that understand trees out there. So we make it about $100 per person, and you get some great training from some of the best arborists in the industry.
Awesome. That's a great way and a great pathway to get into the business. So someone has a very specific question about dogwoods. It says, I have a dogwood tree that has a fairly large section in the middle of the tree that appears to be dead. Should I cut it out? It is oddly shaped. It's an oddly shaped tree to begin with, and it never bloomed very much. They don't want to jeopardize the health. What should they do?
So Neil, we're going to have he said. So my personal opinion is that it depends on where it is. If it's at some visual place, you don't want to see dead wood, some prime place in the garden. But with that said, if it's 1/3% of the tree anyway, it might be slowly on its way out. I like leaving dead wood in bigger dead wood in trees because it's good habitat for, if it's big enough, it could be habitat for birds, or it could be get some rotting creatures in it, little bugs that bore into it, and the bugs, woodpeckers and sapsuckers or whatever bugs, maybe not sapsucker, they actually, beat into the tree and get out what they want to eat. But if it's if it's a main part of your garden, you want to take it out, but it's not really hurting the tree. One thing you could say that, if it's the center of the tree, it's not going to seal that wound if you cut it out anyway. And if it's usually if it's a side branch, it's still going to create, it might be good to take it out because then it can seal that wound. But for the most part, I would leave it. I don't know, Neil, what is your thought on that?
I completely agree. It's interesting because we have sort of the NGO nonprofit approach, and the Georgia Arborist Association is also a nonprofit, but our people are in the business of removing trees. But that doesn't mean we don't really care about them. And tree health care is becoming more and more important, but we'll get into that later. Regarding the dogwood, it's kind of a joke in my neighborhood because I'm an arborist and I have a dead dogwood, like let's say 70% dead in my front yard. But for the exact reasons that Greg mentioned.
Not going to hurt anybody.
As long as there's no target, what we call a target in our industry, and there's not a ton of frequency under that target. So like a car, like you may not want your car to get damaged because it will fail eventually. And that's what trees do. We all fail eventually. So yeah, and it's really a crisis that we have in the metro area and in Georgia in general is removing dead and dying trees because they just provide so much habitat and wildlife, and they're just needed. So as long as there's not a target that you're concerned about, and if you're worried about it, like Greg said, address it. But if you can leave it in any way, and by the way, my dead dogwood is the #1 perching point for bluebirds in my neighborhood.
They love bluebirds. Need that rotten hollow place to put their nest. They don't have to have a bluebird box, but they do need something like a bluebird box, which in nature is a rotting, 8-inch stump. And Neil, I know that a lot of arborists are doing this more often. They're topping trees anywhere from 12 to 15 to 20 feet. I think you have a big one, top too high in your backyard, or maybe
your
neighbor does.
So that would be a dead tree. We don't ever top live trees.
Right. Yes, topping dead and dying trees are dying to make where the danger's out, but you have a place for that wildlife, because it could also be places for woodpecker nests, raccoon nest, possums. Possums are good. They eat ticks. They don't get rabies. So, thinking about what you're comfortable with leaving, not just a dead branch, but, a dead trunk. I don't know what the height is. It like a 15-foot height is kind of what the standard or
Well,
lower?
mine's actually 50 feet.
Tall. Yeah.
So, but I got carried away. But forget bird feeders. If you want wildlife in your backyard, have a dead tree. And the technical term is a snag. Just leave the snag.
You can actually get these labels now online saying why you left your snag. I don't know what it's called, but you can stick label, hammer it into your tree why your snag is there. I wish we had it. Somebody will probably look it up and send it to us.
You could also hire the Georgia chainsaw artist to make a carving into it. I've had clients do that as well.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And it kind of leads into this next question. Someone had a pink dogwood that had a section split because of the storms that we had recently, and it's leaning, and it didn't really bloom very much. So they have 3 of them, and the storm pushed one over, and they don't want to lose any more. So what would you advise?
Well, dogwoods hate wet feet. So if there's a lot of moisture, you need to address that. And the best way to, and we'll say this word over and over again, because arborists love hardwood mulch. And, it'll help absorb some of the water. It will also help retain the water during drought conditions. So, just give it some loving care. And the best way you can do that is provide optimal soil conditions.
Yeah, that 2 to 3 inches of mulch, for a foot of every caliper inch. So if you have a 10-inch dogwood, you want to go out 10 feet around it. Ideally, you can use leaf mulch to mow over your leaves and dump it back on.
Yeah.
But, there are some dogwoods that like moisture, Neil. You have alternate leaf dogwood that don't mind a little bit of wetness.
I never
And
see those.
silky dogwood, yes, they're nice.
I did see a silky
nice
dogwood the other day.
Alternate leaf dogwood's a beautiful dogwood that does like moisture, by the way, everybody. So if you have too much moisture, Neil's right. Don't plant a regular flowering dogwood.
The common the Cornus florida that is the native dogwood
Doesn't want to be wet.
It does not like to be wet.
Moist, not wet.
Yeah.
So what would you say that the signs someone need to look out for to call an arborist? Are there some telltale signs with the branches or with the bark?
Yeah. So what we like to say, how do you spot a tree and when do you need to get an arborist involved? You kind of need to look at the tree as a whole. You need to look at the ground. So you kind of have to have the way arborists look at trees, they kind of look at the 4 zones. So the whole tree, the ground around the tree, the trunk, and then the canopy. And each one of those are indicators of all kinds of information. On the ground, you're looking for fungus, but that they're not always blooming at the time that you're looking at it. Although typically they'll last for years, especially some of the wood-eating funguses. You probably want to get a professional at that point. If you look up on the trunk and you see a yellow fungus growing on it or bark that has been removed, or you see lots of ants, these are all possible, or decay. You see any decay, particularly once again on the ground between root collars. Sometimes there's what we call basal rot, where the rot comes up from under the tree. You need to pay attention to that. And then last, looking up into the canopy, just seeing the amount of dieback in the tree. Just because there are any of these indicators, though, does not mean the tree needs to be removed. It just may need. I always equate it to like having some moles and some limp that I have. As I get older, I'm not the way I used to be, but I still have a lot to provide. And a lot of these older trees actually have more to provide because they're adding more wood each year that they exist, just by the nature of their size and each inch. So we need to just be aware. And if you have a doubt, call an arborist. And we're at the Georgia Arborist Association.org. I do want to say, our website, georgiaarborist.org, we have some public facing information that will help you identify a tree. It's not actually quite up yet, but look at it next week. And then, and all our members, by the way, we have over 400 members of the Georgia Arborist Association. These are great tree care companies, and they do removal. And you can look them up on our website and you go to their website to see what kind of information they have.
Awesome. So can you talk a little bit more about the fungi that you were mentioning? Can you tell us a little bit about what we'd be looking at? Maybe describe the colors that we'd see, if they present any dangers.
Yeah, so there's so many different types of fungus, but just because there is fungus around your tree is not necessarily bad. But if it's growing on your tree, that's probably time. So there's a couple of funguses that we particularly look out for. One is called Ganoderma. The other one is Inonotus striatus. And these are fungus that they are wood-eating funguses. So they could be an indicator of systemic issues in your tree, what we call white rot, or it's weakening your tree because it takes, well, I don't want to get too technical, but it takes out 1/2 of the strength of your tree. It eats the lignin in the tree. So it can greatly reduce the strength of that tree. So if you see a tree that's like tipped over and its roots aren't with it, that's typically a white rot, or it could have been a brown rot, which is a similar type fungus. But yeah, so you want to look for that yellow Amaryllia fungus is also, especially if you see it on your trunk, that's an indicator of some serious decay. So
it tends to be more dangerous, right? I mean, when it starts getting in the trunk, you really need to get it looked at quickly.
Yeah. Yes. And another thing I tell clients about, because I've had people like, does this look bad to you? And there's like a crack, but a crack that you could stick a screwdriver into. It's like, that's something you probably want to get taken care of sooner than later. So there's some things that are more obvious, and there's usually a large amount. When you see a crack, there's already a large amount of decay in the tree. And just because there's decay in a tree, though, trees aren't like us. They don't heal. They compartmentalize decay, and that's why you can walk into a tree sometimes, and actually the tree is fine because it's built walls around the decay, and it's still growing and living with the decay.
Greg, was there anything else you wanted to add about fungus?
Nope, he did a great job on fungus, but I think it does. Fungus is one of those things that you really do need help with to identify if it's a scary one. There's plenty of mushrooms that don't mean anything, and some that you eat, but I wouldn't eat one without knowing what it is. And so if I had one growing on my tree, I probably, if I saw a lot of it, and I mean, even I would ask for some help on helping identify it to see how big of a problem it could be. And they can start doing, some companies will do different ways of measuring how much rot you do have going along with the fungus. One of the techniques is a resistiograph, and I may say that incorrectly. That will give you a sense of how scary your tree may or may not be. There's no guarantees. Arborists can, an arborist can look at your tree one day and say, it looks pretty good. And then the next day it could drop a big branch. It's just the way it happens. I mean, we're not future tellers, but we can reduce the risk. We can help reduce risk.
You bring up a good point, Greg. I mean, we are not truthsayers, but what an arborist shouldn't tell you, oh, that tree's coming down, or it's a problem. What they should tell you is it's a low risk, it's a high risk, it's a very high risk. You as the homeowner are the tree manager. You're your own urban forest manager, your small woodlot manager. It's up to you what risk you're willing to associate. And a good arborist, there's something called a TRAC, tree risk assessment qualification. And if you're going to have someone that's a tree that you really care about, make sure that they have that qualification in addition to their ISA certification. They're a certified arborist, because then they're going to talk to you about risk. They're not going to say, so they may say I've had many clients that keep very high risk trees, and I have clients that want to remove low risk trees. So we're not in the business of telling you what to do. We might try to influence you because we love trees and we want you to keep them, especially if they're not going to be a high risk to you. But that's how a qualified arborist should talk to you about a dangerous tree or any tree in your yard.
So you talk about risk, and one question I have is, how can homeowners mitigate that risk to maybe trees that are at or above the roof line, especially with storm season being here now?
Wow. So, okay. Well, it really depends on the species. I mean, different trees have different types of impacts. Certain trees like sweet gums, sycamores, even pines are
Pecan.
what I call limb dropper. We'll call them self pruners. So you might want to prophylactically prune some branches that are already dead, or especially if it's over your home. Now, with pine trees in Atlanta, they don't generally uproot, although they do uproot sometimes, but they don't generally uproot. You have to worry about.
They uproot more in snowstorms than they do.
Yeah. And ice storms are the big problem with pines, because
and younger trees,
and they're evergreen, so they retain all that ice on their leaves, or pine needles. It is a type of leaf, and that extra weight. But I always recommend, if you have pine trees, don't remove all your pine trees. Maybe if you have a basement, because still the odds are that it's not going to happen, but it does make it either a moderate or high risk to have some pine trees over your house. And we have not had a big ice storm in Atlanta, I think, in like 12 years. So you could either say we're due or they're never going to happen again. I'm not sure which.
Yeah,
they're going to happen again.
For those trees that you're mentioning, pecan, but I'd add to that.
Pecan.
There are times that their trees have more issues. The season for pecans to have an issue is, late summer, early fall, because the pecans start holding more weight as they get bigger. They tend to hold more when it rains. They hold more. They're known for dropping branches, so you may not, you may want to prune, get some of that weight off if it's overhanging your driveway or your patio. And I think, but overall, you try to keep the tree healthy, right? And if you look for structural defects. If you're really concerned, I have a neighbor who really gets concerned about his pecan tree, and he hasn't looked at it every 3 years. He has an arborist go up there, make sure there's not a structural issue, and does a little reduction on some of that weight that's in that tree. So, that's one good thing. You can do some reduction of branches, but cutting off big branches on a big oak tree, if it's not a structural issue, can actually do a lot more harm and make the tree less safe in the end rather than just doing some reduction on some of those branches. The bigger wound you create on that trunk, the more likely you're going to have rot somehow enter your main trunk, which you don't want. Right, Neil? Mostly.
Well said. Exactly agree.
Thank you.
So there's different kinds of pruning cuts, and the arborist should know, there's a heading cut, a reduction cut, a removal cut. A removal cut's a last resort.
Yeah. And people are like, oh, the big branch cut off. It's not a good idea necessarily. You're leaving a wound. You're making the tree less balanced. The tree's grown to have these big, heavy branches balancing it. And all of a sudden you take one branch off, it's not balanced anymore. And also, again, as Neil said, you got to seal over that wound. If you a big cut, it takes a lot longer to seal over that wound.
And it also takes a lot of energy. Once you wound a tree, the tree has to expend energy compartmentalizing that, opposed to growing or sending out chemicals to fight off vectors and pathogens.
Yep.
It only has so much energy. It's like us. Or I always equate this, okay, I've just added myself as a nerd, to the Enterprise. You can't have shields photons and life support all at the same time. You got to kind of choose your poison or your health.
And so you're talking about the energy. I mean, you're also cutting off food. So if you cut off big branches in the tree, it's like telling you have a certain amount of food that your mother or father are eating all the time, and it supports them. But then you decide to cut it in half or a third, and they start stressing out because it's less of what they need. So you're cutting off big branches, just cutting off their food, and it's not a good thing to do.
One of the cool words that I love is photosynthate. That's the food.
Yeah.
And if you cut off the leaves, less photosynthate for the tree.
So speaking of that, and tree structure and food sources and things being on the tree, let's talk a little bit about vines. Are there any creeping vines that do not harm trees?
Yes.
Yes.
There are a number of them. And usually I would say there's only one maybe non-native vine that's okay to grow on your trees. But primarily most native vines are fine to grow on trees. Cross vine, decumaria, which some people call the native climbing hydrangea. Muscadine, if it gets too aggressive, could pull weight and compete, but even muscadine, maybe in your own yard, you might have a little bit of you might want to cut some of it out possibly. But, Carolina jasmine, it's a climber, not a attacher. Any native vine is not going to really damage your tree. But wisteria, the non-native wisteria, terrible. They're beautiful, I get it. But there's a native wisteria that's not as aggressive. English ivy, very bad from multiple different ways. I think I saw a question on that. We can talk about that in a minute, I guess. English ivy, wisteria. What are some other really bad vines? Of course, kudzu, which no one's going to plant, but they may not be keeping it off their trees. It competes with photosynthesis, adds extra weight, and can literally choke a tree. Wisteria will choke your tree to death. Eventually, it's going to choke your tree to death. Wisteria will. Kudzu too.
Yeah, I'll just add that, I'm not as worried about the weight of the vines as I am once that, it usually takes about, for English ivy, once it gets into that 30, 40 year growth up into the canopy, it starts to interfere with the photosynthate. And wisteria can be really aggressive structurally. So I've seen that take down trees. I've also seen it hold up dead trees.
Yeah. Wisteria can become it's a tree in itself. But
yeah.
To me, people will say, I'll maintain my wisteria or my English ivy. The problem is it will be here much longer than you will be.
Yeah.
And an English ivy fruits when it gets into when it grows up. It doesn't fruit on the ground. It fruits when it goes up, and birds do spread that berry, and it becomes a problem for other people in their forest. So ivy should never grow on trees. I frankly would never plant Asian wisteria. I would plant the native wisteria. And if people really love it, I get it. It's beautiful, but it's going to get out of hand at some point, and it is hard to kill. It's almost the hardest plant to kill.
Even harder than kudzu?
Much harder than kudzu.
It's just so pervasive and it takes over. One thing about English ivy, though, as an arborist, one thing that's most difficult for me is it also hides defects.
Yep.
That you just can't see. And you may have like a huge decay spot in the tree and you can't even see it because it's under the ivy.
There's also a lot of research going into the increased amount of mosquitoes in areas that have ivy, because I think so they tend to hold more water in their leaves and underneath their leaves, and you can't see that there's water underneath it. So there's a lot of people have been saying it for years, but now there's actually some research going into how much worse does ivy make the mosquito culture.
So speaking of ivy, how do you get rid of it if it's growing over everything?
So many methods. There's of course the least one that makes people who don't like pesticides hand pulling. You can hand pull it. And some people, I don't know if you've done this, Neil, or not, where you have a friend with you and you're kind of pulling it and someone is shoveling the roots and they're pulling it or rolling it and you're shoveling the roots. If you don't have a lot of trees, you can literally roll the ivy and cut the roots that are connecting to the ground and roll it and roll it and roll it.
Yeah.
And then you pull it up on a big area and you can hand pull what's left as it comes back here and there. But there's other methods. There's herbicides, which is a pesticide, less damaging than insecticides to people and insects and animals. But reducing the amount of herbicide is super important. In Washington State, it's actually illegal, I think, to sell the plant wholesale or maybe even retail. I don't think it's illegal to plant it yet, but they've created some laws around English ivy because it's so aggressive in their forest. And visiting the Audubon Reserve in Seattle, it's a big park. They've come up with their perfect kind of mix chemically. Brian Williams, the forest restoration director, and then the manager, Taryn, could give you that mix. Obviously, some things you can't use if you're not supposed to be using if you're not licensed in spraying. Roundup does work. People have problems with Roundup. I get it. To reduce the amount of Roundup and to make it more effective, we used to have a process at the Atlanta History Center where we would weed eat the English ivy to the ground during the winter. And when that new growth comes up, hopefully before other plants come up, that new fresh green growth is very susceptible to Roundup. So you're not having to spray as much chemical and it's more effective. But Brian and Taryn can tell you what chemicals to use that are a better mix, that if they're more effective, you're not having to spray it as often. So maybe you spray it the one time and you can hand pull it from there. But it's definitely a difficult plant to get rid of. Those are the methods that you can use. The goat method, goats don't love it, and goats tend to be really probably the most expensive method because after the goats eat it several times, you're still going to have to either hand pull it or herbicide what's left. It will reduce the amount of herbicide again, but one of the others are going to have to come in the end. And again, really don't plant it. I mean, I'm going to tell you, as Trees Atlanta, we tell you it's really an environmental thing to do. It's just not to plant it. Find some other plant. Any other plant is better than English ivy for a ground cover. Leaf mulch.
And we just put a link in the chat for everyone. We do have some resources, and so there's a link on how to pull in English ivy and how to remove it. And also in October, we'll have our forest stewardship program, which will give you a little bit more in-depth look at how to remove invasive and targeted species. So manual pesticides, anything that will help. So you'll get a little bit more detailed insight on how to remove those. And it's an opportunity, if you like doing that sort of thing, to become a certified volunteer to lead projects that way.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, and we'll actually educate you on the proper way to use herbicide, because there is a proper and a safe way or safer way to use herbicide. And a lot of people do willy-nilly get into herbicide, and you shouldn't. You need to read instructions, directions, always read your instructions. Neil, I don't know if you had any other.
I was just going to say, there's also a timing to applying. You want to do it at a time where you're not going to affect the perennials, and usually, which is August-ish, I believe.
Well, I like that's one thing about when you weed eat it, which is nice. You weed it in the winter, and you can notice when you weed it to the ground, your perennials are already dormant, except for your Christmas fern, which you dodge, and you can start seeing them come up, and you're more easily to dodge them because you can see the trillium come up, or you can see other ephemerals come up. You can ignore those areas, and you're not hurting it by weeding the ivy. So that's a good, the winter and the early spraying, when things are starting to pop up, you can at least dodge things a little bit better.
Yeah. And make sure you volunteer when you hear an ivy pulling project. That's those people are doing some hard work and it's needed work. I was also thinking most people don't plant ivy. It just kind of comes into your yard from your neighbors or you move
People
to a
do
house.
plant it though, Neil. People plant it, believe it or not.
Okay.
When I worked at the Atlanta History Center in the 90s, we had the English Ivy Society was traveling and they were going to
Oh.
the History Center to see the beautiful English ivy. I was doing a tour and I said, now, if you want to get rid of if you get over ivy and you want to get rid of it, I went through the process of removing it. And the head of that group was not happy with me. But yeah, it's good. It's a good project. Kids love pulling it up. Kids really enjoy pulling it up. Dana will tell you that. They really enjoy that kind of, before, after, and they enjoyed that kind of He-Man, rip it out of the ground, good energy sucker. And if you can identify poison ivy, it's a good thing to do because you don't want to be pulling that up.
Yeah, it's great as an adult too. I found it incredibly therapeutic during COVID. Just like I'm clearing my mind, I'm clearing the ground, I'm clearing my mind. I have a focus, but I'm not overthinking it. I love.
Yeah. I have a school behind us. It's a condo now, and I pulled up half of their English ivy. And then over COVID, they pulled out a good 20% on their own. So it's definitely catching. It's almost like it's a good not habit, but a good obsession to have is ivy pulling.
Yeah, and if you we forgot to mention that if you're overwhelmed by it, remove it from your trees first. I mean, because that's the easiest thing to do. And like Greg said, that's how it propagates once it gets up above ground. So, and it's very quick and super satisfying. But if you remove it from a tree, do not use a chainsaw because you could cut into the cambium of the tree, which is its growth. So you want to be very careful the way you pull it away from the tree and cut it. I like to use a handsaw and either a large screwdriver or what's called a wonder bar. It's like a smaller crowbar. Because if it's 30 or 40 years growth, now if it's that
it can be this thick, it can be this thick, right? I mean,
yeah, you can take a chainsaw to the first part of it, depending on what your skill set is on that. But
you get an arborist to take a chainsaw to it. Let's say that.
You get that arborist to do it, and because he'll have chainsaw pants on and PPE for his eyes and ears. So, and he's insured. So there you go.
I think Neil and I are going to agree on this when it comes to, since you brought up the word chainsaw. I mean, if you want to use a chainsaw to cut wood on the ground, that's your decision. But when it comes to cutting up and around like this or cutting trees down, I think both of us would say, again, hire an arborist. I have cut one tree down early in my chainsaw career and barely missed my neighbor's car by like a foot or two. So not even a foot. It was probably less than a foot. It is a art and a skill, and don't think trees do weird things with weight and the way that they're structured. You do not know trees well enough to prune big trees down. Just want to say, let everybody know that. I mean, you just don't. And I don't cut trees down because of that.
If you do use a chainsaw for some reason, please go to UGAA.saws.org. It's all the safety you need. But like Greg said, if it's above your head, and there's still kickback issues, even if it's on the ground. So,
and you can say this, Neil, absolutely do not go on a ladder with a chainsaw.
No.
It's just, don't ever do it. Never. I don't care who you are.
And if you're over 50, don't even go on a ladder.
I wish you get to 60 now, Neil. My number is 60 now.
I'd rather climb 100 feet up a tree using a rope than get on a 6-foot ladder.
Yeah.
Speaking of larger trees,
we just age ourselves.
Well, speaking of some larger trees and possible issues, someone says they have an oak tree that is over 30 years old. It's been dropping limbs on one side, and on the other side, it grows and stretches out very wide. Their families enjoyed it for over the years, and now they've been afraid to be out under it, especially with grandchildren. So should they seek an arborist?
Yeah,
yes.
I'd say that's arborists do, because there may be a bigger issue there. Older trees will drop limbs. It's just what they do. So don't be under it during a storm, obviously. chances are, there's 24 hours in a day that limb is going to drop when your grandchildren are particularly there. It's a higher risk to get in your car, but not that you shouldn't be aware, but I would be concerned that a whole side of it is decaying.
I
So
wonder if it got struck by lightning, Neil, or something like that.
yeah, that would be a very likely candidate. And there may be some mitigation you could do with cabling or just removal of the limbs that are most likely to fall.
I'll add to that, Neil. I think often people don't look up at their trees, but you need to look up in your tree to see if there's dead wood. And the little dead wood is not a big deal, but big dead wood, and if it's above your car, sidewalk, or house, it needs to be cut out. So, if like any management, my sink is leaking right now, and we didn't notice it for weeks. You have to check out things in your house, but you should also check out your yard. And part of it's managing trees. Is that at a minimum, look for those mushrooms growing on the trunks, but also look up in the canopy and see if you see large dead wood. That if it fell straight down would be a concern for you. If it's in your back 40 feet or 40 acres, whichever it is, it probably doesn't matter. But if it's near the gutter of your house or your fireplace or your car or your kid's bedroom, yeah, you need to be looking at that tree regularly, once a year, to see if there's any major dead wood. Because major dead wood can be taken care of so easily. You hire an arborist, they prune it out, that danger is taken care of.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about mulch. So we know that at least with Trees Atlanta, we love to mulch our newly planted trees and make berms with them. What's a good type of mulch to have, and where can people purchase or get mulch for free?
Okay. So, first of all, one thing I did want to add, so you need to look up with trees, but you also need to stay rooted like a tree. So it's a combination. There's more under the ground than there is above ground. They say that in a healthy tree, there's about 10 times the surface area and roots than leaf surface area, if you can believe that. So think of all that surface area and leaves, and there's 10 times that. Now, an urban tree is probably like 2 times or maybe half. But so you should. So one of the best ways to help the soil conditions of a tree is hardwood mulch. And okay, so mulch, it sounds so easy, but mulch is heavy. And tree companies like to drop off 9 cubic yards, which is about, I'd say, maybe 20 hours, or maybe let's say 15 hours of 2 healthy teenagers distributing. So you have to be prepared to distribute it. The second thing is, because if you leave it, guess what? It's not good for the tree because now it's in its aerobic decomposition. It's creating heat and killing all the roots underneath it, and also preventing water from getting down there. So I've seen trees killed by excessive mulch drop off that hasn't been spread. So ideally it can be dropped off.
Do you see that often?
What?
Does that happen that often?
I'm going to say it's happened in a city that I'm not going to mention that that drops off their mulch regularly in parks. And yes, and it's mind-boggling to me and very frustrating. And all the trees have died. And some really nice ones. You can
overmulch too.
You can overmulch. I like to say, you'll hear arborists going from 2 to 6 inches. If it's a construction zone, you can go up to 8 inches and then spread it afterwards, just to protect the impact on the tree. And generally you want to go out to the drip line and not let it touch the trunk. So I say like a donut. So where can you get mulch? You could just wave down a tree company. And I like to let it sit for a week, just if there are any pathogens in it, nothing's going to survive that burning heat of a mulch pile. That's my theory on it. Greg might have another theory on it, but, and then you can go ahead and spread it. So I like to, and it's a great use of because guess where that mulch is generally going? To the dump.
Terrible place.
It's literally going to landfill. And could it help break up some of the landfill? Yeah, but there's not enough of it. But if you can use it in your small yard, so wave down a tree company. They'll be happy to. They do not want the responsibility if they break your driveway, though. So, yeah, yeah.
To add to that, I think, letting it sit, and the longer you let it sit, probably the better, but it's not good if you let it sit under the tree.
No, it should be, it's one thing impervious,
or away from the tree, or not barely
or
on the
away
tree.
from the tree, but
Yeah.
I love it when it's on cement.
And because composted, that if you let it sit for a year somewhere, it makes some great compost. It's even better mulch because it's kind of breaking down.
It's true.
And a little bit less fresh, because it does suck the nitrogen out of the soil when it's fresh. For the wood chips to break down, it's pulling nitrogen out of the soil, which it re-releases it. So it's not that big of a deal once it starts to rot, but it does do a little bit of that cycling of the nitrogen.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's cool, isn't it? The other thing I was going to add was, you can buy it as well. But I would say that I still think cypress mulch is a problem, if I understand right, Neil, that there's a problem of going to cypress swamps and cutting trees out for mulch, and which is a terrible thing. Cypress swamps are a very unique ecosystem and it shouldn't happen. So I'd say avoid cypress mulch. It does look pretty and it smells good, but I wouldn't use cypress mulch. And if you want to avoid plastic bags, your landscape companies that will deliver it. If you want a better looking mulch, like Cummins, I'm gonna put it out there. So I can't put it. You won't see a tree company name, but I will say Cummins, which is there on Memorial Drive, will deliver it to you. So you're not using all this plastic. And if you don't have a truck or a car, they'll just deliver it to you, and it's pretty affordable. So I like Cummins in Atlanta on Memorial Drive. So they're a good one. And the last thing I'm gonna say about mulch, and you throw it in whatever, is that don't buy the dyed stuff. Why put any more chemicals into the world? I have people who refuse to use herbicide, but then I see them buying red dyed mulch. I don't know what the dye is. They may say it's natural, but why put any more unnatural things in the environment? Just get hardwood mulch, not brown dyed, not red dyed, not blonded, just non-dyed mulch. That's my personal opinion.
I agree. Go to georgiaarborist.org. Almost all those companies will drop off mulch if you contact them. And go to their website first, because they usually have a place that you can do it without even contacting a person. So
they'll be happy to help you.
Yeah. And ideally you could use the same species of what that you want to mulch, but unfortunately I just don't think we can get that precise yet.
You might want to, sometimes most of the big companies will know not to deliver something with poison ivy in it, but you might want to say, please no ivy or poison ivy we don't want that. And most companies wouldn't do that. I think rarely does it happen, but occasionally it does. So it's a good thing just to throw in there as a reminder.
Oh, it's also a great lawn killer. So I just want to.
And it's a great organic matter adder to your soil. If you're in an urban, sorry, Neil, if I interrupted you, but the suburban development, you've got nothing but red clay, you start piling on mulch, and that in 5 years, you might actually have decent soil again. Because, they scrape off all the topsoil, but that can add that organic back into the soil. So maybe adding it every other year, 2 or 3 inches, 5 or 6 years, you're starting to really save and make better soil.
So have them dump it on your turf and leave it there for 2 weeks. And by the way, what to do with the mulch? You can expand your mulch beds all the way out to the drip line, and it'll be less to mow, less monoculture, less noise pollution, less chemicals. And you're creating a natural ecosystem in your yard that helps retain the fabric of ecology in our city.
Yeah. More mulch, more life.
The magic of mulch, mulch madness.
Mulch mania.
Mulch mania. These are all hashtags, by the way, right?
Right. So I have a couple more questions. One is, within the city, there are a lot of newly constructed homes that are on very small lots. The builders are usually maximizing the lots with more house than yard space. What risk does that pose to the existing canopy's root zone on these lots?
Clearly, I mean, you're reducing the amount of places to plant trees and you're cutting root systems, which, you know, some trees are more susceptible to others. They say a 30, that 30% rule the city of Atlanta uses, critical root zone you can get into with treatment. But the truth is 30% is stressing out those trees. I mean, I've seen white oaks die with less than 20% root construction. Some species just don't like to see any, much of any, and especially the older the tree, the less disturbance they want. You know, right, I mean, I don't get into the tree ordinance discussion because it's too long, but, one of the things we're trying to do is encourage less disturbance. So, if you can reduce the disturbance of construction sites, you're going to save more trees and protect more root zones. Unfortunately, the way it works right now is that most impervious surface that's allowed in construction rules are in the zoning, not in the tree ordinance. So to reduce the amount of impervious area would have to go through zoning and not a tree ordinance. I don't know, Neil, to add to that.
Yeah, where it really starts having a big impact is on when you're impacting the trees, the neighbor trees. So most cities have what they call a boundary tree ordinance, where you can't impact a boundary tree more than a certain percent without having to bond it. In other words, because you could easily kill your neighbor's trees just by impacting the roots on your half of the property. So that's where the ordinances are usually more aggressive in making you protect the tree. Yeah, but it's sad because it's like the more land disturbance, like Greg said, the more, and the problem is, I'll just say this because I've thought about it a lot. When lots are selling for $300 a square foot and trees need 900 of those or 600 of them, it's just a really, that's
Difficult balance.
It's a difficult balance. And that's why the older mature canopy that we have now, don't let anybody say that it can be replaced, because it won't be replaced in our lifetime, our children's lifetime, or, maybe our grandchildren. And that's assuming they planted the right tree in the right place, the right way. So the land values are just too high. You're never going to get the amount of land, and 70% of our canopies in your backyard. So
yeah, I mean, we like to dictate that people have smaller homes, but we both have smaller homes, but you can't do that. So, but I mean, one thing that cities might start doing is reducing that impervious surface area, or reducing the work zone, construction zone area. And maybe houses get taller or whatever, or people start to understand that, healthy trees mean a healthy city that people want to live in. And we need to keep our tree canopy, but not everybody's as in tune as probably somebody that's on this program listening.
And our last question, are there certain trees within the Piedmont, specifically in the metro Atlanta area, that are no longer doing well because of changes in the climate or contagions or pests that are present?
So I think you're going to find that there are going to be some species that are suffering more. They're the ones that start in the Piedmont and grow north. And I think in the urban areas, you're going to find that you're going to see more of those trees struggling than some of the suburban and forested lands. You're going to see it first in the downtown Atlanta, Decatur, Roswell, Sandy Springs, where the trees that are going to be more challenged with that heat load and maybe air pollution, but probably more heat load. In longer term heat, that doesn't ever cool down. Heat that doesn't cool down in the evenings because you have too much concrete is very stressful for trees. They don't get a break. So when the heat load doesn't cool down as we have more pavement, that's a big problem. We find that red buds in our right-of-way are having more challenges than we had seen 15 years ago. But it is, it's an understory tree, so that might make some sense. One of the things that as an organization we're looking into, not just saying we're not going to plant certain trees, but we're going to look to finding sources that are south of us. Because, white oak grows, hundreds of miles north of us, but also goes, about 100 miles south. So we start getting what's called a genotype, where where the genes are southern genes versus the northern genes, they might be better with climate change. So we're pushing our nurseries to find southern selections of trees that grow from South Georgia all the way to, I don't want to say Wisconsin, but there are some trees that grow in Wisconsin. You want to find those that are growing in the southern part of Georgia and Florida and Alabama, and not going for seeds grown trees that are from upper states.
That's neat. I'll add that, the Piedmont here in Atlanta, we're at the very southern range of the Piedmont, and it's a very delicate balance that we run here, being, just above the 800,000 feet where a lot of these trees thrive, and they need a certain number of days below freezing to really, thrive. And as those days become less and less, there's more vectors and pathogens. So really the best resolution, in addition to planting the trees that are more adapted, is if trees work in community and forests. So the more that they can be with each other and contiguous, they can protect themselves from heat island. They can protect themselves through their root systems and sharing resources and really, so to protect our Piedmont, if you have a contiguous area of trees, that's highly valuable. And if you share that with your neighbors, that's highly valuable. And I hope you, do whatever you need to do, like mulch it or take care of it, because it's probably connected to other trees on other people's properties. And we just have to keep an eye out for the Piedmont to thrive. It just needs to be together in a sense.
Cool it down.
Absolutely. I think that's actually all of our questions. Those are really, really good questions, and also awesome explanations. Thank you so much, Greg and Neil, for all of your expertise today. If you enjoyed this segment, we do this every third Wednesday of the month at 12 o'clock during the lunch hour. So please look on our website to sign up for the next calendar event of Ask the Arborist. And we hope that you guys have a good afternoon. And if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. Send us an email if you have questions that didn't get answered or if something pops up.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Dana. Thanks, everybody who joined us.
Thanks, guys. It was a pleasure.